Hi, I'm Greg Farrar, and this is my latest episode. Oh, look, I have a lot of tabs here, don't I? All right, that's fine. This is my latest episode of COVID-19 Trends live stream. I will be covering the countries of the world, the states of the United States, and the counties of California. I do have a chat here, so drop a question in chat if you'd like me to focus on something or have a question or want me to look at a particular region. Whatever you have to say, drop it in chat or put it in, as a comment in the on the video itself on YouTube. So let's go. I continue to spend more time than I expected on building up these graphs, so I'm doing another live stream, even though it's only been 2 days since the last, because I just have a lot of new stuff to show off. Table of contents, by the way, now. If you go to the website, gregfarrar.us, the table of contents lets you jump to particular categories, and especially among the states, there are several new graphs. All right. In total cases, as always, the United States biggest and growing. Brazil is pretty big, but India continues to grow. India has very few cases per by population, very low in daily cases per million, but because it has so many millions, it has moved solidly into third place ahead of Russia. However, actually I'm going to go straight to the daily cases per million. I'll show the broad picture here and then look at the new graph, which shows this in a much more granular way. So broadly speaking, we have Bahrain still as the top, and Qatar, as always, is on our graph, but just keeps dropping and dropping. It's not a hot spot anymore. It's heading quickly into not even being a warm spot. So good for Qatar. Its neighbor Bahrain is not doing quite so well, but at least is stable in daily cases. And then we have Oman and Panama. Panama, part of that Central South America cluster that continues to be trouble. It's really broadly an American cluster, because certainly the United States also continues to be trouble. South Africa as well. And the United States, they're not the worst by any means. Certainly, even at 220, it is a hot spot. Over 200 DCPM, daily cases per million, counts as a hot spot. But the United States is not a super hot spot. It's just barely hot, and certainly nothing like where we've seen for Qatar. Or even Bahrain, which is stable at 350, is well above the United States. And then we've got Israel coming on strong here. The same graph here in a rather different format. This is one of my new dark background graphs, which are typically different from my usuals in that, first of all, they show a moving average. So the lines wiggle a whole lot, and the lines very quickly notice changes. I often, with this sort of graph, I often find myself saying things like, well, you can tell that, for instance, these dots down below show that Oman is probably dropping, but this trend line hasn't caught up with it. The trend line here, the low S trend line, does not quickly bend. But this one does. You'll see this bends on a whim, turns on a dime, and so these tend to be pretty squiggly, kind of ugly lines, but they do give us a real sense of the detail, the nuance of day-to-day, or at least week-to-week movements. And often, something like Qatar, there's not a huge difference. You can really see the broad trend here as well, but for instance, you could look and say, oh, there's just the slightest sense that Qatar maybe is only barely or is barely starting to unlevel out at the bottom there. Meanwhile, we have Bahrain, which, as with the other one, shows clearly it is plateaued but not turned towards recovery. And then Chile, which really had a bad time of it a few weeks ago, is doing better. I'm going to zoom in on Chile alone for a moment just to get a sense. Part of the Central South America cluster, Chile peaked above 400 DCPM. That's very high, but then that was a fairly quick peak of just, let's see, each of these lines is 2 weeks in this case. So the peak was about a month long, and now it's recovered down into warm spot territory and trending downward quickly. I'm just going to kind of walk my way around at random, as I always do. But since we're in Central South America, or since we're in America, let's just throw a few other of the major Central South America, North America too, lines in here, just to get a little bit of a sense. Brazil needs to be there. I think I put it in there, right? Is that Brazil? Yeah. So Brazil, again, has peaked, probably. Maybe it's plateauing now, but Brazil peaked without ever becoming a hot spot and is slightly descending now. And we saw that Chile also peaked very hot and is quickly descending now. The United States not showing signs of peaking. It is heading upwards, though you may see a little bit of a bend on that, a little bit of a sense that the United States may be bending toward a peak. And then Peru, for instance, is kind of on a plateau and is hovering around the bottom of warm spot territory. Let's take a look at the United States in this graph, the growth. If we look at the United States growth graph, this is good. This is something we haven't seen recently in the United States, which is that it is showing a very solid trend toward recovery, in that, though it's still growing every day, and in fact every week it grows about 20% new cases right now. That used to be 35%. Just a couple weeks ago, we were seeing 35% daily growth in cases in the United States. Now that's only 20%. So we're still rising, and you'll still see the headlines that say, United States set a record, United States set a record. On average, the United States will set a new record every day in daily cases. But there is this sense that it's headed towards zero. And when it hits zero, that's when it will stop setting records and we'll start seeing the cases dropping away. So it's been a while that we've been seeing this really bad trend in the United States, but that does not seem to be the case anymore. The United States peaked on July 5th in growth rate, is dropping away. And how long do we think this will take? Well, very roughly, it's gone almost 20 points in 2 weeks. So we can imagine that it may finish off its next 20 points in the next 2 weeks. Except this isn't quite 20 points. So 3 weeks. It's plausible from the angle of this line, I would say, that the United States will peak in daily cases in 3 weeks. And if this trend continues, it'll start dropping away. Now, will the trend continue? We never know, but promising. Meanwhile, in Brazil, we see an even better graph where Brazil has had its ups and downs. There was a moment, I think this was where I originally said, hey, Brazil is peaking. And then it lost its trajectory for a bit, but it caught it again. Brazil at this point has peaked. This is what it looks like when a country peaks. It crosses zero on the growth chart. It's now slightly negative in its growth, and this is a 14-day moving average, by the way. So this is pretty stable. I'm not looking at just every day and saying, oh, we had a day of 2% drop, so Brazil's peaked. This actually has to be 14 days in a row, which on average had a drop before this line will indicate it. So a pretty stable indicator. Not just this particular point, but the whole downward trend, suggesting that Brazil is heading in a good direction. This crazy graph gives us the ability to look at all the countries. I'll just look at India because India is interesting. India is so large. India has such potential to be a terrible problem. All right, so this doesn't even show the zero, which is kind of interesting. I think I'm going to zoom out so we can see the zero line. This is the current trajectory of India. So it used to be worse, got better, but still we're seeing something on the order of, what is this, 25% per week. Now I think of 40% a week as bad. Anything above zero is bad in some sense, but India has a pretty mild, fairly mild, 3% a day. It's in the middle. It's between mild and moderate in its growth rate. Slightly downward trending, clearly, from here to here, but in the very short term, kind of flat. So India still growing, not showing a really strong recovery. The severity graph. Let's take a look at the severity graph. This is new. This is my new favorite graph. We'll see whether I keep liking it as much as I do. But I actually moved it to the top of the states reports because I like it so much. This does a combination of the DCPM, daily cases per million, but then it multiplies that by the growth rate. So, and actually by twice, no, how does it work? Multiplies it by the growth rate? There was something in there about, I don't remember. I somehow doubled the impact of the growth rate. I don't remember how I did that now. But let's say for now it's just multiplying the two. So when you have a very high number of daily cases, that makes it a problem. It's that itself is a problem just by having a large number of daily cases adjusted by population still. But if you have a very low or a low number of daily cases but a really high growth rate, that will tend to push things up here. For instance, if India had a growth rate of 200% a day or something, it would start showing up here among the countries like Oman, which has a very high number of daily cases and a slight growth rate. So this is an attempt to integrate those two to say how do they compare, how do countries compare in the overall severity of their current epidemic and the historical severity as well. And so here again we say Qatar is getting a lot better. We see a couple of weird spikes. Chile also doing much better now. But I think anything over 100 is kind of bad, so there are a lot of countries, let's just list them off if we can, the ones that still kind of have a problem. From worst, well, yeah, worst. Oman is worst, Bahrain, second worst, I can hardly read that, Panama, South Africa, I need my glasses, the way that it lines these things up, whatever, I can't read it, but someone I know, is that Kyrgyzstan? Maybe. Israel, United States, down in, what is that, 5th place, 6th place? Brazil, here again, dropping in severity. Most of these are rising in severity, the worst ones mostly rising. Bahrain is second worst, but seems to be dropping. The first through 6 otherwise are mostly rising in severity. But Brazil is kind of bad but getting better. Kuwait, kind of bad but getting better. Qatar, as we've seen for weeks and weeks and weeks, is very quickly getting better, but from a really bad place. So even now it's still a warm spot. Armenia, Saudi Arabia, and a few others. I guess I'll try to get through them. Peru, that's Kazakhstan. All right. Someday when I can, it's really hard to pick out this particular one. Is that Chile? I think that's Chile. And a few others. These are just the worst ones. So the world is not doing terribly. It only has a handful of hot spots, and they're mostly small countries. But Israel is up and coming. South America, Africa is up and coming, and there are a few other countries. The United States still dominates the world numbers, though, and so it is certainly problematic that the United States is still rising. But again, you can see a bend in this dotted light blue line, and that bend is what we saw in the growth chart, which is probably the most, I would say, the best news of the day, certainly for me living in the United States, is that the United States appears to have peaked 2 weeks ago in growth rate and is solidly, steadily, quickly descending, suggesting it will hit 0 in a matter of weeks. Now, who knows? Brazil was doing the same thing and then turned around, so we don't know what's going to happen in the future. But given what we've seen, where it appears that typically once a state has had the disease, it typically does not come back with a large resurgence, a large second wave. And given that almost all states have had it or do have it now, it's certainly plausible that this is just seeing the dying embers of the epidemic in the United States. Just worth mentioning, maybe? No, actually, that's in the states section. Yeah, I'm going to move on to the states. So the world's looking okay. It has its hot spots. Not as bad, though, as the states of the United States or the counties of California, as we'll see. So here in the states of the United States, I put the severity graph first because I like it. It's going to fling itself around a little bit zoom-wise while it loads. I have this little thing here at the bottom. I'm trying to get rid of this little thing. Powered by Advanced iFrame. I am using something called Advanced iFrame, and I did buy it, but I didn't quite bear install the professional version right before. I just bought it today. The good news is that the fact that this shows up means that I've been getting a lot of views on these pages. So thank you all who have promoted them to others. If you know other people who know about this, I would love to have more viewers. I spent a lot of time on this, and the more people I feel are getting value from it, the more I'm inclined to keep spending time. So keep spreading the word about gregferrar.us. And I think there are a lot of people who can benefit from this information. So here's the severity of the states. Again, this is growth and daily cases per million mixed together in a way that tries to integrate them both into a single metric. So who's the worst? Well, Florida's the worst. Well, yeah, right now Florida is the worst. But it seems to maybe be peaking. Awfully soon to say that for sure. Arizona, which was the worst, really seems to be peaking. It's hard to say anything but Arizona is peaking, looking at this graph. Louisiana, still one of the worst, and still the sole strong exception to the rule that states never get it twice. Louisiana not only got it twice, but got it a whole lot worse. No, that's not true, actually. If you go way back to the beginning of my data, Louisiana had it just as bad as now. So Louisiana has had a powerful first wave, and now is having a powerful second wave. They did, however, never drop really below zero. So if we wanted, when this is sort of there's this trend that says states go up 30 days, they peak, they drop down below 100, way below 100, and then they never get it again. That's the broad trend we see everywhere. But there's a sub-trend that we see in 3 or 4 cases, which is states peak and they hold on a little below 100, but they get cool below 100. They never quite recover. They certainly never get below 25, and then sometimes they get it again. So it's almost like you stop taking your antibiotics. Like, oh, we're fine. We can put that pill back in the medicine cabinet, and then your body is left to fight the disease for weeks and weeks, and eventually it just loses the fight, and you're back here again. Time to take your antibiotics again, Louisiana. You should never have stopped. And so this may be something like that. When a state gets cocky because they see a line like this, and they say, let's all go have COVID parties or something. So anyway, Louisiana, the sole exception to the regional immune system, regional immunity, metaphorical immunity theory that I've been proposing. Louisiana, the sole exception. By the way, Delaware showed it wanted to be an exception, it seemed like, but it didn't. It doesn't quite seem to be managing it. It did have a significant peak. It did drop to below 100. It even dropped below 50, and then it seemed like it was going way back up again, and it got up to 150, but now it's going back down again. So will Delaware actually become a firm counterexample to the metaphorical regional immunity thesis? Well, it's not doing a very good job yet, but of counter-exampling that thesis. But Louisiana sure is. Louisiana is our big exception. Georgia, you can see Georgia is peaking pretty high, might be dropping, a little too soon to say. South Carolina, plateauing, also pretty high at 400 severity. And severity kind of, I'm for now, as I see thousands more of these graphs, I'll probably develop a sense of what's hot and what's not when it comes to severity. But right now, I'm considering the severity scale to be the same as the DCPM scale, which is to say 200 is hot, 100 is warm. So these are all hot spots in severity. Here we have someone. I need to bring my glasses, because I know with my glasses I could read this. So it's actually my failing vision in my old age is what's making me say that's probably Alabama. So I do think that's probably Alabama. Alabama, the exception to the Gang of Six recovery. The Gang of Six, I'll just pick them out now. Alabama, Arizona, Arkansas, North and South Carolina, North and South Carolina, and Utah. So when we look at this in severity, the only one that's really recovering of those, like in a very obvious way at the severity, in the severity metric, is Arizona. Arizona is doing very well, which is great because it was certainly the worst a couple weeks ago. But let's hop down to the growth. If we hop down to the growth, okay, this is the DCPM graph. This is the trajectories graph. I'm not going to go over all the graphs every time anymore. I've got too many of them. But growth is fun. I could do it on the, actually I think I will, just for comparison. Gang of 6 on the old school growth graph, the rope chart. North and South Carolina and Utah. Here's the gang of 6. Now again, they're looking pretty good, and here we see Arizona, which was certainly the worst, is now the best. In fact, Arizona is, according to this graph, peaking, which is kind of obvious from the other graph. It peaked a while ago, but again, this Arizona, or this particular rope chart is very conservative in how it draws its lines, and so it takes a while to recognize changes in trajectory. Arizona peaked on this graph, is now dropping. The others have also peaked and are dropping, except for poor Alabama. Now, if we look at that on this graph, is this the one? Yes. Somewhat similar to the rope chart. Arizona, Arkansas, Alabama, North and South Carolina, and Utah. So, this is where I kind of like, I like the simplicity of this graph. You just look at it and you say, ah, they're heading downwards. Whereas you look at this red line here, poor Alabama, and is it heading downward? I'd say it's heading slightly upward, slightly, but it's got a lot of wiggle to it. The other ones, though, really do seem to be heading downward. And indeed, Alabama on this one is also the one that says it's heading slightly upwards. But it's a complicated story. Alabama is coming, it can't make up its mind. Broadly heading upwards. The rest of the gang of 6 on this much more nuanced graph are heading downward. We do see Arizona has peaked. It's at 0 growth. We also see South Carolina still in the high teens, along with